Welcome to Voices from the Hill, celebrating the vibrant literary voices of the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm your host, Jennifer Barone, along with Joseph Carboni, owner of Telegraph Hill Books. Each episode, we sit down with a local author to explore their creative process, inspirations, and the unique stories that shape our community. Today on Voices from the Hill, I'm joined by Phil Cousineau, one of America's foremost mythologists, storytellers, explorers of the human journey, and local North Beach author. Phil is the author of more than 40 books, including the best-selling The Art of Pilgrimage, and he's spent decades studying the enduring wisdom of mythology. A longtime collaborator of Joseph Campbell, in particular as a co-writer and co-producer of The Hero's Journey, the world of Joseph Campbell. He's a consultant to Pixar, Lucasfilms, Warner Brothers. He's a filmmaker, a teacher, and a cultural historian. Phil has devoted his life to asking why ancient stories continue to shape modern lives. His newest book, The Wisdom of the Odyssey, 24 Life Lessons from Homer's Epic, invites us to see Odysseus's journey not simply as an adventure, but as a profound exploration of healing, homecoming, and the search for meaning. So let's dive in. Phil, welcome to Voices from the Hill, live in North Beach from Telegraph Hill Books.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. Thanks for everybody coming. It's a Saturday night. I know you've got music to go hear, friends to see, follow up on TV series that you haven't seen for a while, but we love bookstores, right? That's why we're here. We're trying to support great local bookstores, the freedom of expression, and the long thread of epic literature, right? That's why we're here.
Yeah.
That's why we're here. That's under threat. I was with Joe at ALA, American Library Association conference in Chicago just a couple of weeks ago, and it was rhapsodic, a word I will keep coming back to over the next hour or so, because we were in the world of 6,000 to 8,000 librarians trying to preserve freedom of speech. And half of them were wearing I Read Banned Books t-shirts. So we're here to explore this glorious notion of why stories matter, why books matter, why it matters for people to gather in groups to see movies and books and then talk about them, for goodness sakes. So let me start there, and then I will segue into something local, which is what I've tried to do all my career. If I'm in Detroit, I talk about Motown. If I'm in New York, I might mention the Yankees. You keep it local, right? So when I was growing up, I grew up in a castle full of books. We had hundreds of books in the house, so much so my mother, just before she died, told me at one point, 4 or 5 of her friends came up to the house and said, "Rosemary, we love you. We love Stanley. We love your kids. But these books, they're really pretentious. We don't feel comfortable when we come to visit. Do you think you could put them in the closet and then we could have our coffee and tea?" Right? So is anybody ashamed of the books they have in their house? No, we love our books. Right, Joseph? We love our books. We also had magazines. We subscribed to Life magazine. And I remember my father one time reading from a Look magazine article, Life magazine article with the great James Baldwin, in which Baldwin was asked, since 1963, why read? Why care about books and literature? Or as Joe Campbell used to say, literature, that great Bronx accent. And Baldwin says, and this is a very close paraphrase, he says, just when you think you are all alone with your pain and your suffering, you've suffered more than anyone in the history of the world, comma, one of the great commas in literary history, then you read. To me, is part of the mystery of what we're going to be talking about tonight. People have been listening to, with a lyre, of course, reading and now viewing this magnificent story, the Odyssey, for about 3,000 years. And you have to ask why. Why does it keep coming back? This again and again in so many art forms. It's estimated within 100 years or so of the poet known as Homer, a neutral way to talk about Homer. Within 100 years, the images from the Iliad and the Odyssey were already appearing on vases, mosaics, murals, on the walls of Delphi, for example. And we are still obsessed with being turned on by and now arguing about the images. Let me give you a local example of how this happens. We are sitting in the ruins, the transformation of a beautiful bakery, the old Italian-American bakery. Anybody ever hit their bread here? Do you remember? Okay, good. This is my tribe. Often when Joe and I have been here about 30 years, often I write through the night up at the top of the hill, and I would tumble, as we sometimes say, tumble down the hill after an all-night session, 6 a.m., and I would bump into Lawrence Ferlinghetti here. Sometimes we would wait for this to open in the morning so we could come in and get our first cup of coffee of the day and our bread. So Lawrence, I remember one morning, we would chat a bit before he went off painting in his blue pickup truck, and I would go to a cafe to get 4 or 5 more cups of coffee to keep going. One time he stood out here and he said, "Oh, I know, George Whitman, right? Because I was one of the writers in residence at Shakespeare Company in Paris for 7 months. I got to live up in the old library there. And he said, yeah, George inspired me to open City Lights. So that was cool. That's a cool connection, right? Paris, Shakespeare Company.
Sister bookstores.
That's right. Twin sister bookstores. That's right. And he said, when I first opened up the bookstore, I had to keep 3 books in stock. He said, first, it was Homer's Odyssey. Had to have that. People were coming from all around the world. They had to get a copy of Homer's Odyssey, both the older versions, Alexander Pope, but also later, the E.V. Rue prose translation, which is pure story. And it's poignant to me because Rue translated this in prose while the bombs were falling on London between 44 and 46. E.V. Rue is the one who came up with the whole notion of the Penguin Classic. Does anybody have a Penguin Classic in their library at home? So that's the origin. Why? Because of a phrase that came to him that is mentioned at least 3 times in Christopher Nolan's version, or I'm now calling it the IMAX Odyssey. Rue believed that civilization was ending. And so he had to preserve. He said, once all the horror of this, 100 million people died in World War II, we are going to have to scrape and cobble together civilization again. And we begin by preserving the great books, the books that have spoken to heart and soul all these years. While he was doing it, he began his first prose translation of the Odyssey. And that book helped keep the doors open for Ferlinghetti. And then the second book was my mentor's famous book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. He said, playwrights and poets, all these people were coming, they wanted Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. And the other one was more obscure, but Fernando Pessoa, do any of you know him? Great Portuguese poet, great. And because I had just come back from 991 living there over in Portugal for a while, and we both loved him. And the line that we share, we loved everything. It's something else besides. That's the way I like to approach the movie. You've got the spectacle, you've got the surface, both of books, but also of music, or like a lot. Then the movie, there's a story behind the story behind the story. For those who are taking notes, and I know the way the elbow goes out and the pen comes out, so I know what Larry's doing in the back there. Fernando Pessoa, everything is something else besides. So I love that as a way to kind of sanctify this building. But a lot of people came here to get their coffee and go on with their day. But a couple more, so stay with me with this. If you walk down Grant Avenue, you'll come to what was the old bagel shop. It was a place where musicians, the Smothers Brothers played there. Lenny Bruce actually sang out his satire there. It's where poets and writers came together, including Jack Kerouac. And I mentioned Kerouac because I've just been invited by the Beat Museum, which is now also the Countercultural Museum in Haight-Ashbury, to come and give a talk on the Odyssey. So I did 15 minutes of research and found out between the two, when Jack Kerouac was at Columbia, he made some notes that said he read the Iliad in 3 days and then the Odyssey in 3 days. And shortly after that began On the Road, which has been often called the American Odyssey, right? So you feel where we're going with this. The influence that spreads out in so many unexpected ways. Keep going down Grant Avenue, turn right to go to Francis Ford Coppola's Cafe Zoetrope.
Yeah.
Right? It's a cafe, beautiful, wonderful restaurant cafe. Upstairs, is where he's been editing films since the 1970s. Do you remember Apocalypse Now? He wants to write the definitive movie, not just about Vietnam, but of war. How do you write the definitive anything except going back to the original template? So he and his screenwriter, John Milius, if you know that whole story with that, they go back to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is a way to talk about the Odyssey. That's the central actus mundi of the Odyssey. Odysseus going down into hell so he can be reborn and finally get home again. What is Heart of Darkness based on? Homer's Odyssey. So you've got the story within the story within the story. You keep moving. Just one more example here because it's fun. It's fun, right? If you go down to the Transamerica building, everybody hated it. Herb Cain hated it when it was first built. Now it's become one of the icons of San Francisco. What it replaced was an old Filipino-American hotel, but before that was a hotel where Mark Twain lived. Also, Robert Louis Stevenson had spent some time there. Hart Crane, if those of you who know some of the great literary associations here. And once in a while, Mark Twain, after he was a reporter here in San Francisco for a while, he would get tired and walk across the street to a saloon run by a guy whose name was Tom Sawyer. That's where you get the title for the Tom Sawyer book. So if you do a little more homework with that, you start to wonder, is there another American Odyssey? Somebody recently said, who has been the American Homer? I think it was an Atlantic Monthly magazine, and different scholars and writers had different opinions about this. Recently they found in the archives in Hannibal, Missouri, that after he wrote his American Odyssey, the story of Huckleberry Finn, which I read when I was a kid with my father, he began an outline for a parody of the Odyssey. He said, classics are books everybody loves and nobody reads. And I want to find out why. Why don't we read these classics? So, there's my Argus over here on the side here. So what I'm leaning up to is a wonderful comment that helps set the stage. It's one of those moments when I found a great thing that I wanted to put into a book, but I had just pressed send on my laptop. The book was already with my editor, and you know what it was? It's a passage in Bob Dylan's Nobel Prize acceptance speech from 2016. Dylan, who used to hang out with the Beats right down the street here, in which he says right in the middle of this speech, remember, he didn't go there to accept the speech there in, was it Stockholm? Instead, he sent in a speech a year later. And right in the middle of it, he writes, Odysseus was a traveling man. And he had to face a lot of obstacles and ordeals. And he went through a lot of pain. And somehow he survived. He kept going. Pause. There's a bit of an ellipsis there. And then he says, a lot of you have gone through the same thing. God, what a glorious way to talk about this thing. In ancient Greece, they used to call mimesis, which gives us our word mime, or to copy something. And the Greeks, ancient and the classical Greeks believed this whole notion of watching an athlete, watching an actor perform in a play, listening to a musician, listening to a bard perform something like the Iliad and the Odyssey is what allows the archetypes that are behind our beautiful stories to get into us, to get into the bloodstream. That is what endures. Not just plot, not just structure, not just history. These stories that we can deeply identify with when you say, oh my God, how did Homer know what I was going through? How did Jane Austen know what we would be going through 300 years from now? So that's what I want to explore tonight, this mystery of identification with the stories, the poems, and now the movies that we love. How's that?
Yeah, so I went to see the movie on Tuesday night, and I was telling Phil that I just finished his book like 2 days before the movie. And I had this gorgeous lens of perceiving the movie through, like, what are the learnings? What is the wisdom that is coming from these experiences that Odysseus is going through? And it was more profound probably than seeing it without reading this book. And so I highly recommend, if you haven't seen
It
it,
worked.
please read Phil's book first, then go to see this movie. But I wanted to,
Sure,
because I'm
sure.
a poet,
Mhm.
right? So, and you talked about Lawrence Ferlinghetti too, and City Lights and Kerouac. This is an epic poem, and I wanted
Right.
to ask you about that format too in this modern day, in this modern time. So you say, for instance, in your book, you have a line that says, in Greece, there is more than what is visible. There is the invisible, what is known only through the eyes of myth and poetry. So I kind of want to ask you, what is it that can only be understood through the eyes of poetry in particular, which is the original form that this was written in? And is there an aspect to its being in poetic form that makes it so special?
Thank you. Thank you. That's what Woody Allen said at the end of Annie Hall. It's total heaviosity. Do you remember that line? Well, getting into the meter, one image that I have in the book that speaks to this, the ancient Greeks believed that Homer's dactylic hexameter, which is 10 to 12 syllables, in some of the longer lines, even up to 17 syllables, replicated the sound of the oars in the sea. Doesn't that take your breath away? It should, anyway. That's what the Greeks felt, that this is a poem after our own soul, right? So here's one of my theories about story that I use when I teach screenwriting down at the American Film Institute for decades now. I still teach with people like Larry at travel writing over at the Book Passage Conference, that think of a story as a circle like this. It's also been an emblem for the soul. Van Gogh said, I think life is round. A mysterious line in a letter to his brother Theo. So if you think of a story as a circle, but it does not go clockwise, that's chronos time, chronological time. Story time, myth time is dream time, and it's counterclockwise. That was one of the great innovations by my mentor, Campbell. All story times go against the clock. That's why we have these wonderful phrases in the language, against the grain. My main man, Bob Seger from Detroit, against the wind. Do you remember that? It's because when you're really following your purpose, your destiny, you have to break away from your parents or the church that you grew up in, whatever it might be, you break away. You are not in chronos time. You're in poetry time. You're in a state of rhapsody and or reverie, which is going against the clock. So that I see the structure then. Every people has a history. Everybody, there isn't a single culture in the world that hasn't had folklore, poetry, myth, dream work, dream analysis, dream therapy. So I like to think of it as the overstory is the plot. This is what's happening. This is what the journalists, God bless those journalists who are risking their lives every day to get the story. That's the overstory. The understory is where I live. I was a journalist for 6 years, between 16 and 22. I've done that. But I became so much more interested in the soul and spirit of stories, of art. I want to know what moves the human heart and soul. That's where poetry lives. And that's why the Greeks fell under the spell of Homer. It wasn't just interesting. They had already the nascent histories by Herodotus, Thucydides, and then later the playwrights. But it was Homer that fed the soul. And it's one reason why they are so, let's call it exercised about the movie and the liberties that have been made to make the movie the way it does. And I am trying to be in the overlap between the two because I've also worked in the movies. And I know you've got two different kinds of language. You've got the written word, which I hope everybody in this room loves, but you've also got a certain exigency, a transformation, almost an alchemical transformation has to happen to the written word, the oral word, for it to become a movie. There is a transformation there. I think a real quick story, because so many of you know my relationship with Campbell. He had not seen a movie since, as he told me, since the talkies came in. The last movie he had seen was 1927, a Charlie Chaplin comedy, and he just stopped. Remember, he went and lived in Europe, and he was hanging out with Carl Jung, Thomas Mann, James Joyce, all these cats, musicians. He was also a saxophone player. When he came back, the talkies came in, and the problem with the talkies is they're too literal. He says, I want poetry. He says, I want art. He says, I want soul. So he didn't see a movie for years. He and his wife, Jean, a famous dancer with the Martha Graham Company. And finally, in 1968, she felt a little fluish one night. And he startled her. I got the backup story from her as well, but by saying, Jeannie, go see a movie tonight. They had been married for 40 years. They had never seen a movie together. So they live in the village. They walk around from Waverly Place. What's the nearest movie theater? If any of you know the village there, the Waverly Theater, which is now one of the centers for independent filmmaking in the world. They didn't even look at the marquee. So they just walked inside the theater. Joe just wanted to keep her happy for a couple hours, right? They walk in, they sit down, the curtain parts. Any of you get a thrill when the curtain parts? You're right. The music comes on, thus spake Zarathustra. So Campbell goes from Charlie Chaplin to Stanley Kubrick in 41 years. It gets better. 5 minutes into the movie, if you remember how it starts with the scenes of the Australopithecines in the cave, and then the tools and so on, and with killing the gazelles and so on. At the scene, and this is very relevant for what's happening in the Odyssey, and this is what Nolan is trying to capture, and we can discuss whether he does or not. It's fair game. When you get this big, it's fair game. He elbows Jeannie, says, they've been reading my book. How could that happen? Well, the story goes, and it's an analogy for what we can talk about with the Odyssey, Christopher Nolan. And it's this. Kubrick had found a short story by Arthur C. Clarke in 1951 called The Sentinel. It was a short story that dazzled him because it's very metaphorical language, again, metaphor, poetry, about human evolution. And if you remember the famous slab, it's a big trivia question. Who plays the monolith in 2001 Space Odyssey? Well, it appears 4 times in 2001 Space Odyssey, which is a riff on what? Homer's Odyssey. Right. It was intentional for that. And every time the monolith appears, there's a huge jump in human evolution. What would trigger that? What would trigger that? That's how a filmmaker is thinking. I've got a short story, but I want it to be a 2.5 hour, a 3-hour movie. So we found the work of Campbell. His volume called Primitive Mythology, in which there's a passage that says, the beginning of human consciousness, which is a concern of Homer, by the way. There is an argument to be made that Odysseus is the first thinking character in Western literature and Western civilization. He does not act by pure instinct. He is thinking his way through these 20 years that he's gone. And so Kubrick takes Campbell's notion that the beginning of human consciousness is the awakening of awe and wonder. This is what moves us on from being just brute instinct. What I believe is what my father told me to think, or what my husband told me to think, or what the Pope, I heard this growing up French Catholic. I don't know what I think until I read what the Pope has to say about it. And that's when I threw my hands up. All right, I'm out of church now.
I do believe like philosophy was invented in Greece also, correct?
No, it's the study of this. And that's why the analogy is important for me here with this. Nolan wants to make a movie about one of the most important stories ever, but he begins with the human heart. If anybody saw the interview with Stephen Colbert, the second to last interview that Colbert actually has in the program, he finally asked, at the end, you're an interviewer, and you know this, he asks for his last question what we would have asked the first. What inspired you finally to make the movie? Mm. Remember, he had been appointed the director of the movie that became Troy with Brad Pitt, but he had another obligation, so Wolfgang Petersen ended up directing Troy, and he always wanted to come back and take this on himself. So what was it? This is my entry also into my version of the Odyssey, which is that it is the first tender and tough epic. It's not just tough. It's not just about testosterone. It's about tenderness and love. Love is the magic formula here that brings Odysseus home again. How do you get to that? So Nolan says, surprisingly, he said, I didn't have a dog when I was a kid, and I really resented it. And when we raised our 3 kids, my wife and I, we were too busy to get a dog. A couple of years ago, we had a small break in our home life. The kids were out of the roost, so we finally bought a dog. And then here's a beautiful thing. He says, I pick up that dog, and I remember the famous scene in book 17 out of the 24 books of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus and his loyal friend Eumaeus, one of the most beautiful portraits of friendship in all of literature. Eumaeus and Odysseus in disguise are going up to the palace. They have to be careful or they could be murdered if they're found too soon. Very careful. It's all kinds of testing in antiquity. And what do they find at the twisted staircase leading up to the citadel, up to the palace? They find Argus, as Homer says, that his noble hunting dog, waiting for him after 20 years. And now comes the rise of something that is so sublime in the story. This is not a testosterone-driven hero. He's the opposite of that. He's what's called polytropos. His mind is constantly turning around every issue, around every experience. He's thinking for himself. He's also tender. So he knows at this moment, if he jumps down and recognizes his dog, who's growling right now, if she knows I'm talking about dogs again. So he reveals what, if any of you sports fans out there, you know the quality that, I remember Charles Schultz used to describe in Joe Montana, Cool Joe, or Joe Cool. Remember that? Or now when we talk about Steph Curry, what's different about Steph Curry out there on the court? Keeping a cool head, as opposed to being a hothead, which most heroes in epic literature are. So at this moment, Odysseus displays what the Greeks call sophrosine. It's the ability in a marriage argument with your kids, an argument with somebody over here at Union and Columbus who's cut you off because he's late for an appointment. Has anybody been cut off over here before? Can you stay cool? This is one of the distinctions in the great Odysseus. He can stay cool. Why? If he bends down, pets the dog, recognizes the dog, he will be immediately shot, and his wife Penelope, his son Telemachus, and all his friends will be immediately murdered in the palace. There's a metaphor here. Something is coming in this book that's not in the Iliad, that's not in any of the other literature of the time, and it's a signal that we can break the cycle of vengeance.
I have a question about that. So you talk multiple times throughout your book about the Kairos movement, which I found fascinating. But and you wrote about Odysseus having a level of self-mastery, developing that throughout, where he exhibits self-restraint. I think that's what you're describing. Can you talk a little bit about what it takes to get to the Kairos moment?
Well, remember, we talked for just a minute there about the chronological time. Goes the clock. Kairos time is sacred time. It's also the time, it's sometimes called the ripe time, the ripe moment. Kairos is a god. He's also the god of synchronicity. If anybody here loves Jung's ideas on synchronicity, he's the god of that. He's also the god of openings. You have a single minute to walk across that crowded gymnasium floor and ask that pretty girl to dance. That moment will never come back. You've got 1 minute to return that phone call that says, we're looking for a writer for a new story. Life comes at us rapidly. And the Greeks personify this as a god. It's a sacred moment. Kairos is a sacred moment. And the Greek poets that I have come to love describe this as the infinite moment. If you know how to honor that moment, the sanctity of time, time begins to expand like this. And the way that I deal with this, again, poetically, so thanks for the lead on this. If any of you remember the phrase from, it's kind of medieval mysticism, all the way to paradise is paradise. Do you remember that famous phrase? I play with that in this book by saying, all the way to Ithaca is Ithaca. How does he keep going? What pulls him back? Arguably, the first evidence we have in Western literature of the thought of suicide is in the Odyssey. He's lost all his crew. He does not know if his wife and child is alive. There's a moment where he almost lets go. But I think there is something that he grew up with. If you grew up with North Beach, you're a little different than if you grew up in the Sunset or in LA, right? You felt there's something in the land. I think that's where the whole notion of us rooting for our home team comes from. You are sinking roots. If you say, I'm from Cleveland, I'm from Detroit, I'm from North Beach. If I tell people, remember, we used to coach some kids here in baseball, and when William and I would tell them, you know who grew up here? The three DiMaggio brothers, they grew up here. You begin to root. The Odyssey is a story that has rooted the Greeks for 3,000 years. And every time Odysseus makes these difficult decisions, do I keep going or do I give up? Remember, Calypso says, I will make love to you for the rest of eternity. What's wrong with that? I'm beautiful. I'm a goddess. Isn't that enough? Do you remember the line? The translation I love comes from this notion that he learned something powerful about love, not just leadership and all the martial arts. He learned something about love. He loved the land itself. Henry David Thoreau thought Homer was the first nature writer. That's an enormous statement because the poetry, the line is a description about nature. You don't need them, but it adds poetry to the
I
story.
kind of feel like the goddesses and the mythical creatures are spirits of the land and spirits of the sea, which is what
wonderful.
I read in my book. But like, do you feel that when you say that? Because that's what I'm pulling for. Like, mythology or these mythic beings are, not to be taken literal. They're actually land spirits, water spirits, and ancient cultures had this visceral experience of the invisible world that you mentioned. Things are invisible, but we have actual relationship with them. We give offerings. They're part of our daily life. Like, it's actually a living, breathing, invisible world that we have relationship with.
Every cloud had a god.
Yeah.
Every emotion, love, envy, desire, lust, trust, they were all personified. That's the word to keep thinking about. Otherwise, you go into the world of the abstract. What is that? Larry, you might remember this. Pico Iyer, the great travel writer, says there's one thing about travel that's so great is it saves us from a life of the abstract. Go and see it for yourself. Don't think you know about these things. But and as much as I love books and literature, and this is my life, there is this wonderful other approach that says read about it and then go see it for yourself. I think that's at the heart of the mystery of Homer himself, to go to these magical places, see these magical lands, because they believed in both the visible and the invisible. So who is pulling you forth? This is a book arguably about enchantment, because it's the whole enchantment about Paris and Helen that begins the war. And this is a major mythological statement that you cannot say just in pure prose. Thucydides could not have said this in his histories. The Trojan War, symbolically, mythically written, was caused by the inextricably mysterious, strange connection between love and war. It's right there. Who is the goddess of love? Aphrodite, Venus, right? Who is her lover? Ares, the god of war. Homer is playing this out. Why do we love war? You think you understand war intellectually? Really? With all the wars that are still going on now, Will Durant, in his histories, said in roughly the 10,000 years of history, we have maybe 22 years without war. Just in recorded history. It is a deep, deep mystery that you have to write poetry about. Sappho, what's that great line of hers? Some say the cavalry returning from war is the most beautiful thing in the world. Some say the ships coming back from a battle at sea, that's the most beautiful thing in the world. I say the most beautiful thing in the world is the face of the one you love. Do you feel that? There's some majesty in there. And you can't say that in prose. You can't say that in natural language. And Homer is trying to record at his time, so we're talking the mid-7th century here, what he felt something was ending. The memory of this noble, noble past. Remember, he's writing a time when already the Trojan War was 400 or 500 years old. So he's writing about a world that fast disappearing. I think that's one of the many, many tectonic forces inside the poem. Why? Because people have always been at war, and they have always been sending soldiers out to fight these wars. Was No Country for Old Men? Remember that line? It became a movie title. Remember that? It's a mystery. Why do all these old men send their young men off to war? They glamorize it. And where did the glamour begin? In the Iliad. when Achilles is told by his mother, you've got two choices. And this is poetry, sheer poetry, gorgeous. If you look at the Iliad, even Emily Wilson's new translation of this, the goddess Thetis turns to her young son Achilles and says, you've got two choices. We are still telling our young men and women going to war, we're still telling them this. You can either live a long, long, calm life out there as a peasant, as a farmer, maybe as a fisherman, and you'll be at peace, but no one will ever tell your story. People will forget about you within one generation. But, this is the goddess speaking, but she says, if you go off to war, I will make you nearly immortal. You remember the thing, she grips, you know why we call it Achilles' heel? This is no extra cost on this, because she wants to make him immortal, so she grabs her baby, the infant Achilles, drops him in the river, the Lethe River, to make all the rest of him immortal. But where she holds him by his heel doesn't feel the water, which is why that is the most vulnerable place on Achilles. That's where he was finally shot, and that's where he dies. And we still, if anybody ripped it an Achilles heel in the room, that's where the image comes from. In this case, Achilles learns that if he goes to war, he will earn something we are still talking about today. If you die for your country, we will talk about you forever. We will honor you forever, which most of us find is a terrible, terrible lie. It's called kleos, K-L-E-O-S. It's one of the most important words in all of Greek culture. You will go to your grave fighting for glory and fame. And so the key, let me do that final point with this. This is one of the turning points for me in the whole book. And many scholars agree, Nolan does this, it's a riff, but it's so powerfully done. Briefly, remember Circe says, I will turn your men from pigs back into human beings if you stay with me and make love to me for a year. That's not in the movie. There is no eroticism in the movie. There's hardly any sensuality. That's one of the missing ingredients here. But it's erotic, and it's also at the heart of the Greek miracle. The Greek miracle constantly says it's love, it's passion that will preserve your home, preserve your marriage, preserve your relationship with your children. It's love. An Odyssey without this eros, and I mean the deep eros that rules the universe. See. So the beautiful thing that Circe says is, you will go home. I will help you go home. She gives him directions in the sky. Go off to sea and sail between Orion and the Big Bear. It's the first indication of navigation in all of human history. It's beautiful. If you've ever sailed, this is a gorgeous detail. So he goes, but she says, you have to go into the underworld. This is our first died and resurrected hero story. This is 700 years before Christ. It's before any of the Indian and Buddhist mythologies. Odysseus is so lost. He's not a lost sailor, he's a lost soul because he's been at war. And he has to go to, and this is old metaphorical language, he has to go to hell and survive and come back to talk about it. It's not play. It's not going to Esalen for 3 days. I can say that because I've taught there for 30 years. But you get the metaphor, right? That's what I'm doing. You've got to go to hell, which means go into your shadow. Go into the darkest place in your psyche, the darkest place in the culture, and get the advice that will allow you to keep moving home again. So when he's down there, he gets some advice from Tiresias, but here comes.
I was going to say, like,
Can I just finish that,
sure.
that one point, which is important? He encounters Achilles himself in the underworld. And this has been one of the turning points in Western literature. He's about to compliment Achilles. He's saying, we're still talking about you. I'm sorry, you're dead. I'm sorry, you didn't survive the Trojan War. I really feel bad about that, but is there some consolation? Paul Scott, I'm still talking about you, Paul. It was worth all the sacrifice you've made to reopen Julius's castle. We will talk about you for 1,000 years. It feels like it's taking that long, right? And now here, then we can turn it over. Achilles looked at him, and you can practically hear him say, you idiot. Which, by the way, idiot is Greek for people who don't vote. How about that? All right? It's you moron. which is Greek for fool. He says, I would give all those stories, all of that fame, all that glory for one more day of sunshine. You feel that? This is the first time someone has deeply questioned the martyrdom of war. And now Odysseus knows he's got to let go of that warrior complex, and he can finally steer his way home again.
One of the really devastating scenes is when the head of, I do believe, Athena is, desecrated after the Battle of Troy. We have that really intense moment where we almost are experiencing man's loss of control after violence, right? And then we have the scene with Circe where men are turned into pigs. And we're kind of turned into this is their true nature, actually, that I'm revealing, But in a lot of ways, you talk about the story of Odysseus also being in parallel with, let's say, recent wars and people coming back with PTSD. Warriors coming home, but home is not the same. Home is not welcoming. Was the Odyssey, I think you're getting onto this point, one of the first anti-war pieces and trying to warn us into the future. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it's so important right now, this book, and powerful right now, this book, to be this is what the government doesn't advertise, which is the effects of war on our men, on our sons, on our people, right?
Well, say the Iliad has been used in war colleges, war universities for centuries, from England to India, South Africa. It's been read and used at West Point since the 1860s. So it is the archetypal template for books about the horror of war and the chasing of honor. And some wars, of course, are necessary. Necessity herself is a goddess, Ananke. All these forces that we're talking about, when they are threatening to overwhelm you, they become personified in a god or a goddess, every one of them. So we have to be, when you feel those huge urges coming up, or you see a political speech in which you begin to feel manipulated, there's a god, what's the old phrase? If a tremendous amount of emotion comes through the door, a god or goddess has just entered. So it helps you to think about which one? The Odyssey is a kind of release from that. It's offering in a number of places an option to this unthinking, instinctual reflection about violence itself. So I love your examples here. Circe, in most of the earlier male translations, I'm saying from Alexander Poe, Chapman, even up to Fagles, I even think uses the word witch, which has terrible connotations, of course. People like Bettany Hughes from England, the great historian, and now Emily Wilson in her really majestic translation, they use sorceress, healer, to describe there's something very, very different going on here. They're still dealing with the forces that you brought up. So thank you with that. But someone like Emily Wilson or Bettany Hughes and some others are saying, this is a book not just about savagery, but about healing. Odysseus is an open wound. When Odysseus becomes Ulysses in Italian culture, and we're in an Italian bookstore here, I've been looking for the reason why for years, and I found again after I turned in the manuscript, when Virgil is writing the Aeneid and he's borrowing from the Odyssey, he keeps hearing with his Italian ear. Maybe you could explain this to me later. He's hearing Odysseus becomes Ulysses. Ulysses becomes Ulysses. In Latin, Ulysses means healed scar. The Odyssey, this long journey that takes 10 years to come home from the battlefield, it is not a beeline straight back to Ithaca. It is zigzagging like a terrible New Yorker cartoon. He's all over the Mediterranean and the Aegean, because that's what happens to your soul when you are trying to heal from trauma. Trauma is a Greek word for wound. And then a big issue in therapy, psychotherapy, I get all kinds of therapists who actually come on my tours in the footsteps of Homer, in the footsteps of Odysseus and Penelope, because they're dealing with so many patients who are open wounded, still stuck in some old wound, in abuse somewhere. And I feel terrible about that. You can't do any spiritual one-upmanship with this. What did Herb Cain call it? You can't be Berkeleyer than thou. He actually said that. So with hearts, what we're emphasizing, we're celebrating a book of healing. For me, this is a map of the soul. He is not a lost sailor. Odysseus is a lost soul, and he's trying to retrieve his soul. He cannot get back to Ithaca. And if you want to use some of the original language and the original imagery, he cannot get, and I mean this with all due respect and a sense of beauty behind it, Penelope will not allow him back into her bed, their bed, the famous olive trunk bed on Ithaca, unless he's healed. And if you don't believe the power of this metaphor, talk to women whose husbands are warriors who have never talked about what happened at war. We have to emphasize this. This is a story that was already 500 years old when the poet known as Homer is wandering around the Mediterranean, hired as a professional storyteller with some say he actually played the lyre. Others say he traveled with a young man who played the lyre or sometimes a flute. And my sense of this, my visualization of this is he tried different versions of this story for years, his entire youth, writing the Iliad, and then later into adulthood, tried to see if this character works, if that character, if people don't laugh there, or if they don't gasp, he's out the next time he goes to Mycenae. And now he's going to tell the story in Sparta. And now he's going to tell the story on Ithaca itself. What we have now, and what I'm trying to comment on in my book, The Wisdom of the Odyssey, is the version that worked. It's the version that sang to people's hearts and souls and reflected them. What would have been on their minds? You know, the life expectancy in this period, around the time of Homer, would have been 30 to 35. And most of your adult life was spent either at war or suffering some kind of plague or disease. Death was rampant all around you. And the stories that come here, they are a little tough. They're bittersweet, or as the Greeks actually said, Sappho says sweet bitter. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that we've got that backward. But these are the stories that would have reflected what was going on in their own lives and did more than that. So it's not just journalism and it's not just history. Homer, through this spectacular combination of some history, some myth, and fairy tale, all of the stories in the center of the book, the sirens, which you are so familiar with. Buy her book of poetry about the sirens, by the way. The Cyclops, Scylla and Charybdis, the floating island of the winds. These are all fairy tales that were probably plastered on top of the myth itself. Why? Because it's the function of fairy tales. It's been the function of fairy tales throughout history to show magical transformation. He is healed, not in real time. Odysseus is healed when he encounters these phenomenal powers in these worlds that are beyond journalism, beyond history. Joe Campbell, we filmed him once doing a 1-hour version of the Odyssey, which was like that guy doing the FedEx commercial years ago, talking a million miles an hour. But in there, he said, and now Odysseus goes off into a dreamland. The poet known as Homer is saying something about that. We can be, not always, we can be healed in our dreams. We can be healed if we go into a world that's numinous and magical.
I want to also bring it back to the role of women, because you mentioned in your book that most of the healing that Odysseus experiences through the female characters and maybe the female thinking and perspective on life. So, after a lot of people have seen the movie, there's a lot of, intense debate about the role of women in the Odyssey. I want to say, a lot of people go immediately to, if you're a woman and you're reading the Odyssey, like, we have to identify with Penelope. But personally, I identify with Odysseus. Why? Because I like to travel. I can live out of a suitcase and never come home. I love adventure. Like, I'm worldly. Like, I'm a Sagittarius. But that being said, you bring up quite a bit in your book, and I so appreciate this, of how important the female perspective is. And I think, and you can tell me what you think about this, like, I don't necessarily think that just because you're a woman, you have to identify with the female
Thank you.
character.
Thank you for that.
But in your book, you suggest that even men, I think you say this, need access to a more feminine way of knowing. And I so
Oh,
appreciate it
Well, thank
as
you.
a woman. So
I'm
what
married to a feminist. What do you
yeah,
expect?
so what do you see
Yeah.
as the role of female wisdom
Right.
and skill, and how that is represented like deeper than just surface level in the story of the
Well,
Odyssey?
beautifully framed. Thank you. And it's also a chance then for us to make the segue then into the movie, because it becomes so important. The way that this is actually portrayed cinematically, because this will be the version young kids grow up with.
Right.
It'll be the one you maybe reappraise what you read when you were a kid, because it's so over the top. It's spectacle. And remember, I'm the word guy. I love writing books on the origin of words. Spectacle means appearance. It's the superficial front. And if you were trying to go, this movie costs $500 million. It's the marketing with the film cost itself, which means in Hollywood mathematics, if you will, he has to get $1.5 billion back just to break even. And you don't do that by just making a movie for the art house. Okay, a few of us are going to go to the Castro and see this, and isn't that sweet, right? No, you've got to go as wide as possible so people all around the world can identify with. That's the mystery. Can people identify with your stories? Not just admire, but identify with them. So what's surprising to me, and it's because I read this every year, like Borges, the great Argentinian writer, read Don Quixote every year of his life. I've read the Odyssey in different versions all my life. It's the template for me. I read it as a kid. It still talks to me now. But what's different as I grow older is you realize Odysseus is not motivated. He's not driven by sheer testosterone. He is not one more Marvel comic book hero. Instead, Odysseus gets home because of 5 women, 5 female powers. If you start to think about it, it's kind of staggering, because Homer arguably then is not just the world's first sports writer, the first nature writer, the first recipe. He tells us where the shish kebab comes from. Achilles sticking his sword in the side of a piece of cattle. There's your first shish kebab, the first yogurt, the first cheese. It's fun when you start to go down this road. He's also the world's first feminist, because he is saying that if a man sticks to only the male point of view, pure instinct, pure id, he will face catastrophe. He will be lost. This comes up again and again and again, which is why the polytropos epithet is so beautiful. He's able to turn his mind around. So he's directed home again and again because of Athena. And Athena, I'm still trying to figure this one out, appears half the time in the book as herself, a beautiful goddess of what? Wisdom. She's the goddess of war, but she's also the goddess of wisdom. She is constantly reminding him, grow up. You're grieving too much. You're making another predictable male mistake. I'm paraphrasing, but this essentially is what she's saying. But the other half of the time when she's in the book, she appears as mentor, which is very mysterious to me. It's in and out, in and out. What I'm reading into this, and this is the everything else, everything is something else beside. You have to look at these great epics and now great movies for their hidden meanings. What's invisible there? What's poetry there? And in this case, mentor, which means mind maker, he is a character. He's been left behind by Odysseus to look after his son while he's gone, because he's not sure he will ever come home again. You know, Anthony Burgess, any Anthony Burgess fans out there, he wrote a travel book about the mid-19th century. Up until the I would say the 1850s, half of the travelers, diplomats, traders, merchants, traveling philosophers looking to have a conversation 1,000 miles away, never reached home again. That's how dangerous travel has been since the mid-19th century. It was risky to leave home. So you needed something more than strength, something more than just strategy or tactics. You needed inner wisdom. Why did I leave home? What am I really looking for? So Athena is his patron, constantly appearing in a moment of crisis when he's lost faith in himself. Who are the others? I'll go through this quickly, then we can open it up for questions. It's Calypso. She's promised him immortal love, but Hermes is sent down to say, let him go. 7 years is enough. Why 7? That seems arbitrary. No, 7 is a mythical number for transformation. 7 days of the week, the 7 chakras, on and on and on. 7 signifies something is about to turn around, inside out. Jung called it enantiodromia. What's been going in that direction now spins in the other direction. Circe shows him how to get home, sends him to the underworld, right? A Nausicaa, who isn't even in the movie, and that's something I miss. She's the princess of these magical people on Phaeacia, which is probably modern Corfu, which this episode makes Homer the first science fiction writer. I bet you didn't see that coming, because when he arrives on the island, the beautiful Nausicaa, and Larry, this is the first example of people playing ball in all of written history. Odysseus wakes up under an olive tree and he sees this beautiful princess and her maidens throwing a ball around. That just makes me laugh every time I see it. Oh my God, I thought I invented baseball. No. So then he goes to the palace. He's greeted by 2 automaton steel dogs that have been invented by Hephaestus, the god of the forge. Goes inside the palace. There are 50 automaton female servants helping everybody eat, bringing them their wine. So what does it signify? What it signifies is that he will be healed in a magical dreamland. And he has to pay attention to the women who keep popping up in dreamland. Finally, when he gets home to Ithaca, he is safe because Athena appears again and then brings him home to whom? To Penelope. And this is part of our segue then into the movie. There's the beautiful opening sequences with Anne Hathaway, who surprises me with this strength of her performance. She occupies Penelope. And my wife, Jo, here tells me that she saw an interview that said Anne Hathaway discovered an interview with Maria Callas. Jo, what was it? An interview? Channeling Maria Callas, who played in one movie, Medea. She played Medea. That's her only appearance in a movie. And if you ever see a film clip of this, you can see this on YouTube. It's staggering to realize the steel bar that's through her spine there. This is what Anne Hathaway is trying to access. It's very, very impressive. But there's no eroticism. There's no sensuality with Penelope. There's none with Calypso or Circe. And so I tremendously respect Nolan. I have to, because I'm going to be on NPR on Monday following Christopher Nolan. And it's the film critic on NPR who's going to ask me, so we just had Chris on. What do you think about the movie? So, see, I'm exploring here what metaphors work and what don't. So, a movie without humor, or an Odyssey without humor, without nature, well, nature's there, but without humor, without joy. There's a tremendous amount of joy in the Odyssey. That's not here. So Nolan has made a choice. You know, it's a famous line in Hollywood where I've been working since 1981. Someone will come, they won't say, hey, love your movie, man. Wow. They'll say, like your choices. Come up to an actor, like your choices, dude. It's kind of inside baseball talk. It's really wonderful. So, every one of these crossroads with different characters, scenes, do I conflate this? Do I just jettison that? Nolan's making a choice to tell a brisk story that would otherwise take 9 hours.
Yes.
He's got to do it in 3. The question I ask you when you go to see the movie, does it move you? Not are you impressed? We know it's impressive because it's a spectacle. My question always, with art, with poetry, with music, with my beloved baseball, is, does it move me? That's a very different question.
I got one last question because I have to ask it.
Sure.
So maybe not everybody might know we are in an Italian bookstore. Most of the Odyssey actually takes place in southern Italy. So southern Italy used to be Greece. Greece occupied southern Italy. And in my hometown of Napoli, we have the area of the sirens and all this stuff. However, going back to a point that you made earlier about female characters, the sirens and what each one means, the mythic ones, the sirens have a wisdom song, but when people do think about metaphors with them or their meaning, they tend to go toward the temptress, the person that's going to eat man-eater. But they had a wisdom song. Like, what is it to be learned from the sirens? And arguably in the movie and most of the book, the siren scene is always like very memorable, like one of the most memorable, like mythic scenes. But what does it mean to glean wisdom from the sirens?
Well, that's a very large question, but it's fun because for a lot of us who grew up with the YA version or the comic book version, or Kirk Douglas with the sirens in 1956 that I saw at the Wyoming drive-in in Detroit, Michigan, you remember the sirens because they're voluptuous, right? In the beautiful sense, also a Greek word, right? The question again is, what do they mean? And that's what I'm trying to explore again and again. What is the whirlpool, the Scylla and Charybdis? What does it mean? What does it mean that it takes 17 years to go home? What does it mean that a hero is contemplating suicide? It's not just plot. What does it even mean? It's that the Greeks want to go to Troy. Remember, Albert Camus, one of my heroes in literature, says, we fight for plunder. We fight for greed and goods. The Greeks fought for beauty, which is a very romantic way of thinking about a romantic way of talking about the Trojan War. In this case, the sirens mean many things. Homer doesn't even describe them physically. This was a later tack on. It's almost as if the description of them roaring down from the mountains and seizing a few of the soldiers and ripping them apart to
And they were
shreds.
half woman, half bird originally, not mermaid. In the medieval times, they morphed into mermaids.
They constantly changed through history. But why does Odysseus put beeswax in their ears? One of the things Homer is telling us again and again is that men specifically in this kind of mythology are very prey to seduction. The seduction of sex, the seduction of power, but also the seduction of knowledge. So again and again in antiquity, Odysseus, he's not described as a warrior. He's described as curious. One of the lines is, he traveled, his fame was far flung, which I love that phrase, far flung fame. And he would go out of his way to see and meet different kinds of people and respected them and asked them their stories and their songs. So he wanted to know their songs. So one of the interpretations by Robert Graves, if anybody of you know Robert Graves, the White Goddess and so on, his theory is the song that they sang, which is a huge riddle in mythic literature, the history of literature. What was the song that threatened all these men, right? What was it? Was it just sex? Because they're supposed to be beautiful but dangerous, which sets you up. It's almost film noir at this point, the femme fatale, right? Or is it something else? The reading that Graves gives that I favor here in my book, the wisdom behind this, is that the very thing that makes Odysseus unique, that he's hungry for knowledge, like no other hero in antiquity. He will go anywhere to learn one more new thing, to find one more new group of people. But that could also get you in trouble. You can become over-intellectualized if you read too much. You have to sacrifice something for all that reading time, all those knowledges to learn everything about law or sports or the history of justice. What's the history of justice? So he knows that every time his crew has the opportunity to be seduced by women characters, they are vulnerable and they die, they perish because of seduction. So he wants to hear the siren songs and break the spell. Mm. That's part of the beauty to me. And I think it's why it's Kirk Douglas tied to the mast in the 1956 movie with all those muscles rippling, right? Is he going to break the ropes just with his sheer strength? He wants to hear the siren song, but learn how to say no. So in a nutshell, just one little cycle here to think about.
Again, like self-restraint,
It's
self-mastery.
it's self-mastery, self-control in a way that we don't see, and most male authors just forgot about for the next 2,000 years. That has become part of the stereotype. But here, he knows he can't get home again unless he begins to break the enchantment. So in a nutshell, 3-act structure, just like Aristotle. I think Homer was one of the most enormous influences on Aristotle. What we think of as 3-act structure in our movies today and a lot of our stories, the whole thing begins with enchantment. Everything is a spell. War is a spell. Love is a spell. Disenchantment in the center. He has to learn how to break the spells of seduction, the spells of monsters, the spell of being bound by what do you call it? Fame and glory. And then when he gets home again, he has to learn how to re-enchant his world. When I wrote my book on the art of pilgrimage, which some people know here, I had an occasion to spend a few minutes with Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And I asked him, so what do you think in your tradition, kind sir? What's the deepest value of pilgrimage? And he said, it's not just going to that sacred place halfway around the world and thinking you're hip because you've walked the Inca Trail and nobody else, has. And so there's a lot of one-upmanship with pilgrimage and so on. But he says the real value is being able to come home and recognize your own backyard as sacred ground. And I think that's at the heart of the Odyssey. Odysseus comes back and he has to learn how to love his wife and his son and his father again. That's where the book ends, in beautiful poetry. He's in bed with Penelope in all the major translations. After all these tests, they haven't seen each other for 20 years. And she says something that is one of the most beautiful lines in literature. Come, tell me of thine ordeal, for my heart can take it. I know you've gone through hell, but you know what? I'm strong too. I can take it. And then the story gets better because Odysseus is kind of full of himself and he wants to talk about his 20 years and all the adventures he's had, right? But then it kind of catches a breath and Homer says, and then Odysseus turns to his wife Penelope and says, and what have you endured here while I've been gone? What was it like for you to raise our son alone? What was it like for you to be sieged by these 108 suitors? And you know what? That guy actually listens. Men forgot how to do this for the next couple thousand years. So the book ends in love. This is what pulled him home. But it's not a sentimental kind of love. This is equal. The husband and wife are equals in Homer's vision. Now, in the movie, it's problematic for some of us because, first off, it ends not like a Greek comma tragedy. I think that's the term for it. Some humor, but also some human tragedy. Instead, it ends like a King Arthur legend that's married onto an American Western. And there are reasons for this. I'm still mystified. We're going to go see the movie again tomorrow to try to deconstruct this, I guess. But the issue, it's deeply haunting the modern Greeks. They hate the ending of this movie because he doesn't stay around. Instead, he and Penelope leave. There's no love. There's no eros there. Yeah, spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert.
Plug your ears with bees.
But here now, I'm trying to be very fair as a filmmaker, not just a writer or a commentator on the myth. And it's this. When you are going wide like this and you are trying to resolve a story, this is what's important for third act structure. That's why most stories have, right? Most stories, travel stories or huge movies have third act problems. How do you bring it home again? It's actually one of the phrases. How do you bring it home? How do you bring your characters home again? In this case, they leave. And there's no eros there. Instead, what happens is predicted, but the story about them or Odysseus leaving within days or weeks of coming home again is a much later addition. 2 to 3, maybe even 400 years after the Homeric edition that we've been reading for so long. But there is a tradition. It's just much, much later. Like us redoing a movie from the 1930s or 40s. We do this all the time, right? It's not talking to us today, so let's redo it. Nolan, I think, is having this, sometimes it happens to screenwriters and directors. You go from the archetype to the stereotype. The archetype means stay home. There was something deep in the human spirit that says, I have made it back, and now it's my job to restore the castle, the home, the family, and so on. But there's another urge which is deeply heroic, and it's the Western American myth. You come home, but you're not going to stay. You're going to get on your horse and leave again. So I invite you just to do something playful. If you go back to see the movie or you see it for the second or third time, the ending of the IMAX Odyssey, Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, is shot almost frame for frame along the lines of John Ford and John Wayne's The Searchers, which is regarded again and again and again as the greatest American Western, and it's based on Homer's Odyssey. The Searchers, the story of this uncle who has found out that his daughter, played by Natalie Wood, if you forget her first movie appearance, he is outraged with a sense of hatred and vengeance for the other, the Comanches. And it's a story of vengeance, going to find her, and if necessary, killing all the Indians that captured his niece, brings her home. And then there's this great scene. It's very Homeric here. You brought her home. Oh my God, everybody's crying. You brought Natalie home. Now she's going to have a great movie career. Thank you. And then there's this challenge. It's right at the heart of the American myth of individualism. And somehow it made its way into this movie. John Wayne stands there, arms akimbo, arms right there on his hips. And he looks at her and said, don't want to stay. I got to go. I got to go. He turns around. If you remember, the last shot is through a doorway. Very similar to the way that Nolan shoots the ending of the Odyssey. And John Wayne turns around, walks through the doorway. The music comes up. The sunset is in the background. He walks to his horse, jumps on the horse, and John Ford holds the shot for several minutes as our hero. Not just John Wayne, he's the American man, the American male who can't stay home. He says, I've got something more important to do, honey. I'm going out here. It's the American myth of individualism. And if you think I'm exaggerating with this, go back 5 minutes before, and again, spoiler alert if you haven't seen the movie, when the great Odysseus comes home, played by Matt Damon, a marvelous actor who I deeply admire, when he takes on the infamous 108 suitors. In the poem, he does it with 5 other characters and Athena. Mm-hmm. The goddess is there, and she deflects arrows if an arrow comes too close. She gets in the middle because she wants him. She's his patron. She helps him survive. In the movie, he fights it all alone. This is a very American version. I don't need nobody. I don't need nobody. So he's a whirling dervish cowboy with King Arthur's Excalibur sword at his side. It's kaleidoscopic. It's impressive. But what I'm challenging you to do, what I'm trying to do with my entire book, every time you come to one of these images, they're called mythologems. It's a wonderful word from the myths. It means an image like an Excalibur. The Achilles shield, it's so powerful, you do not need interpretation. When Margaret Hamilton, dressed in black as the witch on the bicycle, is flying by Dorothy's window in The Wizard of Oz, as the house is whirring its way to the magical land of Oz, you don't need a subtitle that says, this is a witch. That's practically the definition of an archetype. You know it on appearance. It's right there. In this case, what I'm asking you as deep readers, but also a group like us, we love books and movies, right? And music and so on. If you are deeply stirred, ask why. And read my book.
Yeah, so I would recommend before going to the read this.
If you are deeply stirred, ask why, so you're not manipulated.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the wisdom here.
Yeah.
Ask yourself why. And this is, I like to think it deepens your pleasure.
Absolutely does. It was such a pleasure to see it with this guy. So I do recommend reading Phil's book, The
Bless
Wisdom of
you.
the Odyssey. Thank you so much,
Thank
Phil,
you.
for being on our pod now. Voices from the
Good.
And if you want to learn more about Phil Cousineau and his work, you can visit philcousineau.net. And of course, get his book, The Wisdom of the Odyssey, at Telegraph Hill Books and all your independent bookstores. And we're going to open it up for maybe one or two questions from the audience, and then we're going to move on to a book signing with
Sure.
Phil.
This podcast is brought to you by Telegraph Hill Arts and Literature. If you enjoyed today's episode, please follow, subscribe, and leave us a review. Visit tellhighlit.org to find out about our local events such as author talks, writing workshops, and more. Consider making a donation to support our public programs. If you're a Bay Area author interested in being on the show, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us at submissions@tellhighlit.org. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm Jennifer Barone, along with Joseph Carboni at Telegraph Hill Arts and Literature, and this has been Voices from the Hill. Until next time, keep reading, keep writing, stay inspired, and come visit us at Telegraph Hill Books in North Beach, San Francisco.